Hey Logic listeners, today's video is hopefully going to be a bit of an educational one, so I'm going to start everything off by front-loading, which is the practice of clearly explaining what it is that we're going to be talking about at the beginning of the video. Normally I don't often do this, but for educational and for historical videos, I'm going to begin to make it a more common practice of mine. Today we're going to be talking about the Federal Republic of Central America, not just the one that actually concretely existed from the 1820s up until 1840, but also the other attempts at federal republics of Central America or at other forms of unified Central American states. In order to begin to understand any attempts at building a sort of unified state in Central America, it's worth noting that the Spanish Empire divided up its regions into what were known as Captaincy Generals. These were administrative regions within the Spanish Empire, especially within the Americas and within the Caribbean, that were unified areas under the control of singular people who were generals and were military leaders of those regions. One of them was known as the Captaincy General of Guatemala, and this was the area that included most of Central America, excluding Panama. We're going to go over the history of the Captaincy General of Guatemala and of other Captaincy Generals throughout Latin America in a later video, but for right now, what you really need to know is that this area was formally established in 1609, and it lasted up until the Spanish granted independence to Central America. And it's also worth noting that a lot of people frame the independence of Central America as being a bloodless event, but that's not quite the case, because even though when independence was actually granted to Central America and to the Captaincy General of Guatemala, that area, there were revolutions that took place beforehand that failed and that were put down. So the idea that this was a sort of bloodless freedom gaining is not actually true, and it doesn't actually hold up when someone examines the exact historical context in which it took place. As this is meant to be a very brief introduction to a lot of different concepts, I'm going to very briefly summarize how it was that Central America gained its independence. Please note that there will be a video coming out very soon that actually talks about the independence of Central America in depth. This is one of the next concepts I want to talk about, but for right now I'm going to give you an extremely brief summary of what happened. In 1821, there was a group of Creoles who got together and drafted together an Act of Independence of Central America from Spain. And this act contained, among other things, a measure which said that local leaders would be able to retain their powers pending a transition to local rule, which was one of the key reasons why it was that this was unopposed by Spain and this was unopposed by local leaders. That's one of the key reasons why this was as successful as it was. But after this, and after independence was gained, there was an era in which things were a little bit hectic in Central America, as people scrambled to figure out what would happen to the different Central American states and what to do next. At the time that independence was being gained for Central America, Mexico was forming what was known by some as either the First Mexican Empire or the Mexican Empire. And during this time, Mexico saw an opportunity and moved to annex Central America. Guatemala City, after having lost control of some of the local areas of Central America, some of the different states, decided to vote to join this. And though some people in Central America disliked this decision, there were some who liked it and who viewed it as an improvement over the status quo, as well as a way for them to gain some more safety. This attempt at building a monarchy would turn out to be short-lived, and within about a year, it had dissolved. And while it was dissolving, it granted Central America independence and the right to form its own states. And the Congress of Central America, the unified legislative body that existed in the Federal Republic of Central America and in other periods throughout Central American history, gathered together to declare independence from Spain, Mexico, and any other foreign body that was attempting to interfere with them. The first leader of the Federal Republic of Central America was a man known as Manuel Acre, and Manuel Acre was a liberal elected president who decided to turn against his own group and sort of function as what we now classify as a dictator or as a strongman. He was ultimately defeated, and after he was defeated, a Honduran-born politician known as Francisco Morazan. Francisco Morazan was a decorated military leader and political strategist who died in the wake of his country falling apart, and an attempt to rebuild it, starting from Costa Rica and attempting to build an army to retake the other countries by force and forcibly remake the Federal Republic of Central America. This attempt ultimately failed, and when it failed, his life was ended at the hands of a squad of executioners. In a video I made in the past, people asked me to explain what happened to break up the Federal Republic of Central America. And it was a range of different things, but mostly it was ideological conflicts between people who were conservatives and people who were liberals. And some of the areas in which they differed were that the conservatives were never fully content with where the capital was located, and neither were the liberals, because the seat of power was an important thing to have and to control in the region. But in addition to that, there were also other ideological differences. Some of this were that some of the conservatives viewed the Catholic Church favorably, and they were in favor of doing what they could to aid the Catholic Church, whereas liberals were more secular and wanted there to be freedom of religion, freedom of press, and for things like marriage to be government contracts as opposed to holy ceremonies, and as opposed to being done through the church. The history of unity between Central American states is a fascinating history that directly impacts other attempts to rebuild the Federal Republic of Central America. Not that many people know that there have been a range of attempts throughout the 1800s and the 1900s to rebuild the Federal Republic. There have been various attempts to reform a Federal Republic of Central America, with the countries involved most frequently being Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, and then there being an attempt by a Guatemalan general at one point to reform it in the late 19th century. There were 3 specific events which involved more than one country and involved those countries coming together willingly. The first one happened in 1852, and it was a union of Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras. That lasted for less than a month. The second attempt lasted over an entire year, and it was at the very end of the 19th century. This was also Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. The latest attempt is going to surprise people because not only did it involve 4 countries, it also didn't involve Nicaragua, and it occurred surprisingly recently. It occurred at the very beginning of the 1920s, from January 1921 to about January 1922. It involved Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. They signed a treaty to form a second Federal Republic of Central America. This treaty rapidly fell apart, and their attempt at a constitution was fairly weak, but it was noteworthy because that's something that occurred within living memory for the very oldest people among us. And it's also something that involved multiple countries coming together peacefully. There was another attempt to rebuild a Federal Republic of Central America by force that occurred in the 1880s, led by a general from Guatemala, but that attempt failed because that general died in battle near El Salvador. Each of these attempts, including the attempts by force to rebuild the Federal Republic of Central America, are fascinating episodes in Central American history, and they deserve far more acknowledgement than we've given them. Honestly, it's a real shame that not only are we so blind to Central American history, we're so willing to be, because even if Central American history isn't our own history, we deserve to be able to know of it, and we deserve to be fascinated by it, because it is fascinating. There are a range of events throughout Central American history that deserve the treatment that I'm going to be giving them, and that deserve the treatment that other historians have been giving them on their own, but that people haven't yet been made aware of. There are multiple historians from throughout the world who are fascinated by Central American history, and who view it as a history worth studying, both for its own sake and for its ability to impact modern Central American events, and for its ability to influence how it is that we outside of Central America view Central Americans. I'm excited to be over here creating this sort of content and explaining these sorts of things to folks. I hope that the videos that I make are things that people can learn from and are things that people ultimately find useful. Just know that pretty much every single thing that I talked about today that I gave an insultingly brief summary of are things that are going to be getting their own full dedicated videos in the future. And these are things that deserve to be known. These are episodes in history that people should know about and that people should care about. And frankly, when people know about these events, they do care about them. The idea that people don't care about Central American history is not particularly true. It's more that people don't know Central American history. And when people start to know more about Central American history, they honestly start to get excited by it. They start to like learning, and they start to want to seek out more information on their own. I find the leaders throughout Central American history to be extremely fascinating. I find the various attempts at unity to be extremely fascinating. I find how the different strongmen operated and how they led their countries, and ultimately how many of them were defeated, to be things that are worth knowing and to be things that are worth understanding. These are histories that are really important and that matter to people today. And these things are worth studying. So I'm happy to be here. I hope that you guys can let me know what you think. I hope that you can let me know what you want to hear more about specifically, what sorts of events you'd like for me to cover. And I honestly just can't wait to see you all again. Until then, I'll see you all soon.